In support of the socially conscious athlete, what the sports hierarchy can learn from outspoken athletes. During the 2016 season, one-time professional quarterback Colin Kaepernick sparked a national argument by taking a knee during the ritual playing of the national anthem before every NFL game. Kaepernick's symbolic, unspoken protest was a way for him to create awareness of various social issues surrounding the continued subjugation of people of color in this country. At the end of the 2016 season, however, Kaepernick became a free agent and has remained unsigned ever since. In all actuality, Kaepernick was blackballed by the NFL owners because of the attention he brought to the forefront regarding social injustices that still prevail and plague the United States some 50 years after the passing of the Civil Rights Act. But Kaepernick is not the only athlete, or in some cases, group of athletes, who have been punished by the predominantly white male sport hierarchy after speaking out on issues regarding race and basic civil rights. Throughout the modern history of sport, athletes such as Paul Robeson, Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, the Syracuse 8, the University of Wyoming Black 14, Craig Hodges, and Serena Williams, just to name a few, have had their athletic careers negatively affected and in some cases ended entirely by the sport establishment when they decided to speak out openly about various social injustices that disproportionately affect people of color. This article explored the history of the athletes who spoke out on various social injustices, while also focusing on the predominantly white men within the sports hierarchy who felt it was necessary to punish them for their actions. Why did these powerful men decide to wield their power in such a way? What pressures were they under, and who or what applied these pressures? This article will also discuss the sports hierarchy can do to support its athletes when they attempt to raise awareness on issues that involve many within our society. Finally, the paper will provide a detailed summary of surveys conducted regarding whether or not people support athletes who speak out on social justice issues.
Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Romano, Assistant Professor of Sports Management at St. John's University in New York City, New York. As you can tell from my brief introduction, I'm researching a paper entitled In Support of the Socially Conscious Athlete, What the Sports Hierarchy Can Learn from the Outspoken Athlete. I decided to research this area, create this presentation, and hopefully write a paper on this topic after I had a discussion with the owner of Johnny Salami's, a small sandwich shop located in New Haven, Connecticut. See, I go there frequently, and during my traditional banter back and forth with the owner as I wait for my sandwich to be made, we discuss everything from politics, taxes, his customers, his limited menu, and anything else two people can complain about in that 5-minute window. But one day, as I waited for my chicken cutlet on a hard roll sandwich, just tomato, no lettuce, because I'm a sports lawyer and a sports professor, the issue of Colin Kaepernick taking a knee was brought up. For those of you who aren't aware, during the 2016 NFL season, former quarterback Colin Kaepernick sparked a national debate when he decided to take a knee during the ritual playing of the national anthem before every NFL home game. Colin Kaepernick's unspoken protest was a way for him to create awareness about various social issues surrounding the systemic subjugation and suppression of people of color in the United States. Initially, Colin Kaepernick sat during the national anthem, but few, if anyone, noticed. For those who did notice, though, their only concern was that Kaepernick was being disrespectful to the military by sitting during the anthem. Kaepernick, therefore, decided to address this issue. And he addressed this issue by consulting with an NFL player who was a former Green Beret. And that player was Nate Bauer. As per the discussion, Nate Bauer and Kaepernick decided that in order to be more respectful to the military, he will not sit during the national anthem, but he'll take a knee. And the reason being, according to Bauer, was that, and I quote, soldiers take a knee in front of a fallen brother's grave, to show respect. So at that time, Colin Kaepernick, with the help of Nate Bauer, decided, he won't sit during the national anthem, he will take a knee. And in addition, he decided that he would donate $1 million of his $11.9 million to charities to create awareness about these issues. He is quoted saying, "I am not anti-American. I love America. I love the people here. That's why I'm doing this. I want to help make America better." So therefore, Colin Kaepernick's protest of kneeling during the national anthem was done with intent. It was done with purpose, and more importantly, it was done with care. And again, no one really cared. Few took notice. But that all changed in 2017. fueled in part by politics and fueled in part by then President Donald Trump calling on the owners to, and I quote, get that son of a bitch for not standing during the national anthem. After that, the discussion changed from that being just a friendly debate to that of a controversy, with calls for Kaepernick to be driven out of the NFL. And in a way, such calls were heated. Coincidentally, at the end of the 2016 season, Kaepernick became a free agent, and since that time, he has never signed with another NFL franchise. So there I am. I'm at Johnny Salami's, and I'm trying to have a rational discussion on this issue with regards to why Colin Kaepernick is taking a knee to create awareness about these issues. And I get the typical pushbacks, right? The typical arguments. He works for the owners. There's no place for this in sport. I'm there to watch a game and not watch somebody protest. So I tried again and again to convince my friend that Colin Kaepernick was just trying to create awareness about people of color being unjustifiably killed at the hands of police, and anything needs to be done about it, his response stopped me cold. He said, how many? How many people? Tell me, how many people have been killed? Who, that guy in New York for selling cigarettes and some other guy out there in St. Louis? And I stood there, and I really didn't have a response. I stood there because I didn't know. I stood there because I knew more people have been killed, but exactly how many, I had no idea. I knew about that guy in New York who was choked out for selling cigarettes. His name was Eric Garner. I knew about that other young man out there in St. Louis, actually Ferguson, Missouri. That young man's name was Michael Brown, but I wasn't sure how many. Didn't even know if that number was important, because isn't one too many? And if you're like me and you're not sure about something, you begin to question. You begin to question and you want to find out answers. And that's what I did, right? I started to think, wow, I need to justify my beliefs on this, so I need to do some research. So as I was leaving Johnny Salami's that day with my chicken cutlet sandwich, just tomato, no lettuce, I decided to find out. So as we all do nowadays, we do a Google search. So I put in parameters, people of color killed by police, unarmed, and I decided to go back to the date of my birth. And since the day of my birth, I came up with a list of 164 men and women, all people of color who were all unarmed as they died at the hands of the police. Yes, 164 people of color, black, brown, Native American, have, for lack of a better term, been executed by police since the date of my birth. And that, my friends, is the scroll of names that you see behind me. And I want you to take a look at these names for just a second and look at the various aspects of the people who were killed. The fact that the youngest person was 13 years old. The oldest person was 92. Both men and women. Some women were even pregnant at the time. And take a look at how they died. All by various means. Shooting, tasers, run over, beaten to death. All terrible, all disgusting, and something that should not be part of an advanced society. And remember, all of these people who died were unarmed at the time. So doing my research on a number of unarmed people who died at the hands of the police since the day of my birth, I stumbled upon another fact. I found out that Colin Kaepernick is not the only athlete, or in some cases, group of athletes, who has been punished by the sports hierarchy who happens to be predominantly white and male, after speaking out on these issues, right? Issues regarding race and basic civil rights. Throughout the modern history of sport, a number of athletes, dating back to Jack Johnson, Paul Robeson, Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, the Syracuse 8, the Wyoming Black 14, Craig Hodges, Serena Williams, and the list goes on. And this isn't conclusive, and I don't mean to ignore anybody or keep anybody off the list. But just this brief list shows that athletes who have spoken out have had their careers negatively affected, and in some cases ended entirely, by the sports hierarchy or establishment when they spoke out on various social justice issues that disproportionately affect people of color. So what I'll do today is I wanted to explore this history, right? I wanted to see how give the voice to the athletes who spoke out and see why the sports hierarchy wielded their power the way they did, right? We came down on these athletes to basically punish them or push them out of sports. So So where do we begin? I think the perfect place to begin with is the dichotomy or the split between the sports hierarchy and the athletes themselves. And it is my position that this dichotomy, this split begins with the concept of what we call amateurism. All right, we all have heard of this concept of amateurism, right? But how do we define it? So, as I frequently ask my graduate and undergraduate students when I'm teaching, what do we mean by this concept of amateurism? And the typical responses I get are athletes who don't get paid, non-professionals, players who aren't as good as professionals. But are these answers true? Are these answers true definitions? The word amateur derives from the Latin word amateur or lover. The French derivation means lover of, and in all practicality means a person who does something because he or she loves doing it. It is logical, therefore, to believe that an amateur athlete would then be someone who devotes his or her talents to this love of the sport. But does this necessarily imply that their devotion should not be financially compensated? I don't think so. All right, when I pose this question to my students, typically I get, well, in the ancient Olympic Games, athletes didn't get paid, and that's where this comes from. So why should amateur athletes get paid? Interestingly enough, though, this is not necessarily true. During the ancient Olympic Games, there's evidence that the players, once they won an event, when they went back to their city-state, they were awarded with financial prizes, and in some cases upwards of 500 drachma. And for those who don't know how much 500 drachma is worth, I don't either, but it was enough that the athlete could live off it for the rest of their life. So we start with this false conception that amateur should not be paid because it's deep-seated in history. And then we combine this with how that concept was developed during the 1800s. All right, by the 1800s, a sport, being an indulgence of the upper and middle classes, routinely allowed for the exclusion of the lower working class and people of color. This was true because of the notion of classism, which was prevalent and used as a way to prevent the common folk from mixing with the elite and more sophisticated. It was during this time that the concept of amateur was really created, so that we keep the lower orders or people of color from playing sport with the leisure class. In all actuality, this concept of amateurism is nothing more than a means of control and exclusion, disguised as a moral imperative for sport. And this concept was accepted initially by the Olympic Committee. Baron Pierre de Coubertin, when deciding who would be allowed to compete in sport, they initially took upon this concept of amateurism to keep the lower orders away from the sport. All right, so here you have it, right? This concept of amateurism where the elite are separated from the working class, and then you combine this with the views of race at the time, right? So this sets the foundation for this dichotomy we have today between the rich, established owners of the various sports franchises and the working class or players and athletes of today. See, Pierre de Coubertin, there was a backdrop of racism in what he was doing in some of his decisions. He is quoted in saying, "There is a difference between the savages and the civilized, and that the superior race, meaning the white race, is fully entitled to deny the lower race certain privileges in life, for their own good, of course." So we have this backdrop. We have this split between the haves and the have-nots, the split between the races. So we can see why the predominantly white hierarchy could feel that they have the power to affect and possibly end the careers of athletes who decide to speak out, to speak openly about various issues, social issues, issues that disproportionately affect people of color. So, in my research, I decided to exemplify some events or some athletes. And one of the names that intrigued me probably the most was a gentleman by the name of Paul Robeson. For those of you who don't know who Paul Robeson was, he was an All-American football player, lawyer, activist, world-famous singer, and actor. There you go. More importantly, however, he spent his entire life fighting for the rights of the working class against ignorance and prejudice. Robeson was born in 1898. He was the youngest child of an escaped slave and a school teacher. He grew up in a time when people of color in the United States were discouraged from attending school. In spite of that, after graduating from high school, he got an academic scholarship to Rutgers University. It was a rough start for him, however. When he walked onto the campus of Rutgers University to take classes and attempt to make the football team, he was verbally abused. He was yelled at. He was shouted racial epithets. Some of the assaults became physical. His nose was broken. They dislocated his shoulder. When he was recovering from his injuries, Robeson questioned whether or not he should return. Then he remembered what his father had told him. His father, a former slave, that on the field, in the classroom, or anywhere else, you aren't just there on your own. You are there representing every boy who is a person of color who wants to play football, who wants to go to college. And as the representative, you have to show them that you can take whatever is handed out. So Robeson just didn't accept the abuse. He pushed back against the abuse. And by doing this, he became just an extraordinary human being. He graduated Rutgers University as probably one of the best football players in America at that time. He was an All-American football player. He was a four-sport letterman. He was also Phi Beta Kappa and class valid Victorian. His first job out of college, he decided he wanted to play professional football. Played for a few years, but decided, this isn't very lucrative. I'm not going to make a living at this. So he decided to go back to school. He went to Columbia Law School in the city of New York, and getting educated there. He became a lawyer in 1923. After graduating, he worked for a New York City law firm, but quit when a white secretary refused to take dictation from him. So, therefore, not wanting to play football, the issues with the New York City law firm, he decided that I'll make a career using my voice. So he decided to become a singer and an actor. And soon, he would be recognized as one of the most famous baritones in the world. He made his concert debut in 1925, performed on Broadway, London, and all over the world. He was featured in 13 films from the 1920s to the 1940s. He performed concerts, like I said, all around the world, and amazingly, he sang in 25 different languages. So in his travels around the world, he got to know people, he got to see how various cultures, see how they react to certain social issues that are happening. So he got involved. He went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War to speak out for freedom against fascism. He went to Africa and India to speak out against colonialism. He went to London to fight on behalf of labor unions. When he traveled around the world, interestingly though, he was allowed to enter any restaurant or hotel that he wanted. But when he came back to the United States, he was excluded due to our Jim Crow laws. When World War II broke out, Robeson supported the American war effort. However, he did criticize the fact that there was inequalities within the military, and helped use his voice to encourage a more equal military branch. So, here you have a man speaking out about social injustices, speaking on behalf of the war effort. But after the war, Joseph McCarthy, I think we all know who he is. He was a paranoid senator from Wisconsin who questioned everyone's loyalties and questioned everyone being a communist. So he ended up questioning the loyalties of Robeson, calling him a communist and a major threat to America. He called him a communist, even though Robeson had never been a member of the Communist Party and had no proven communist affiliations whatsoever. And the fact that he supported his country against Hitler during World War II. But the fact that he was just called a communist by McCarthy led to the fact that 80 of his concerts in the United States were immediately canceled. So, as a result of McCarthy calling him a communist, 80 of his concerts in the United States were immediately canceled. And his records were no longer available in stores. Well, you may think, at least he can go overseas and make a living. No, because as a result of McCarthy's accusations of calling him a communist, his passport was revoked. Being revoked prevented him from making a living by performing concerts overseas. It was not until the late 1950s that the Supreme Court ruled that a citizen's right to travel cannot be taken away without due process, and Robeson's passport was returned. So here we have, right? We have an example of a person who spoke up on racial inequality, spoke out against racism, spoke out for civil rights, spoke out about controversial issues within the Americas, And by doing so, his livelihood was taken away by the country that he sported and loved, a country he just wanted to make better for all those who lived there. So that's one example. I go into this in my research and in my writings, pointing out the fact that Paul Robeson spoke out eloquently and forcefully, and his livelihood was taken away from him by the hierarchy. I mean, this one a little bit outside of sports, but taken away by the hierarchy nonetheless. A second issue I address in my research and in my writings is the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City. In the lead up to the games, Dr. Harry Edwards, legendary sociologist and an activist, organized a group called the Olympic Protest for Human Rights. The aim of the organization was to protest against racial segregation in the United States and elsewhere, South Africa, as example, and racism in sports in general. The group advocated for boycotting the 1968 Summer Games unless their conditions were met. And some of those conditions were banning South Africa because of apartheid, removing Avery Brundage as head of the the IOC, adding people of color to both track and field in the area of coaching and training, and adding people of color to the USOC. While the boycott didn't succeed as well as Edwards wanted to, it did leave an impression on a lot of the athletes who were going to the games and competing. And two of those athletes were Tommie Smith and John Carlos. And for those of you who don't know, it's the iconic image of the Black Power salute during the 1968 Summer Olympic Games. Tommie Smith and John Carlos raised their hands, raised their fist in protest. And they did this for a number of reasons, right? They did it because they wanted to symbolize poverty, and that poverty was part of the United States and poverty was prevalent throughout the world. They did it to symbolize strength and unity. They did it to symbolize that most of the athletes there are from working class roots. And they did it to draw attention to the systemic racism that is happening in the United States and throughout the world, and that something needs to be done about it. Right? According to Tommy Lee and John Carlos, they did this to regain Black dignity, to bring attention to the plight of people who were less fortunate, to wake up the conscience of those who had lost their conscience, and encourage people to stand up for what is right. So the two athletes on that podium, after winning their medals, raised their fist in order to bring attention and awareness to issues that plague not only the United States, but the world with regards to systemic racism. And the reaction by the USOC and the IOC was to punish the athletes, right? To take them away, take them out of the Olympic Village and send them home. Right, to dismiss them from the games, in other words. And once they were dismissed, they were sent home. And while home, they received a steady stream of threats on their lives. They were pillared by the press. They had a hard time finding a job, and they had a hard time finding a way to take the momentum of winning medals in the Olympics and cashing in on it, that, for lack of a better term. So I use that as a second example. There are many more. There are many more examples that I'm researching and putting into the paper. But interesting fact about Tommie Smith and John Carlos, that I was at a conference 2 or 3 weeks ago where John Carlos spoke. And someone asked him why he used the Olympics, why he used that event, why he risked his medal to raise his fist in protest, and to raise his fist to create awareness. And it was an interesting comment. His comment was that, today, athletes, if they want to get the attention of the world and talk about issues that are concerning to them, they can just jump on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and they can talk to the world. In 1968, I had one way to talk to the world, and that was on the platform of those Summer Olympic Games, and I used it. So, interesting stuff. So, again, I'm researching this, putting this paper together. If anybody has any feedback, insight, comments, criticism, critiques, I'm open to anything as of right now. Again, my name is Robert Romano. I'm a sports management professor at St. John's University in New York, and I thank you for your time.